Hey developers, have you ever wondered what the differences between React props and Vue props are, and what the difference between slots and children are? It's a little confusing if you haven't used React and Vue, so today I'm going to compare and contrast both of them. We're going to look at some examples using this button, and you're going to learn a lot by the end of this video. Hey, so the other day my React friends were asking me what the difference was in Vue when using props and slots, and what exactly a slot is when you compare it to React. So in this video, we're gonna take a look at those two, and we're gonna do some compare and contrast, but before we get too far, let's have a quick word from our sponsor. The very first website I ever created was back during my high school days using a very old Packard Bell computer and hosted on GeoCities. It was for a classroom assignment and I got an A. That really opened up my curiosity on computers and led me to major in computer science in college. But did you know that in the US, only 47% of public high schools even offer computer science classes? And out of the 219 countries out there, only 73% are either only piloting computer science in high school or doing nothing at all. I truly believe that computer science and tech education can change someone's life. Our sponsor, .tech Domains, along with Namecheap, are donating 100% of their sale proceeds to code.org, who are helping every student in every school have the opportunity to learn computer science. I believe that everyone should get a chance to follow their passion in tech. And if you feel the same way, show your support by visiting go.tech/codewithErik, or click the link in the description below to know more and do your bit to make a difference. Awesome, and I hope you guys check out .tech Domains, but let's go ahead and jump into this. So I have an app I created here, and I have two apps. So this one is in VS Code. It's Vue 3 using something called Vite, which is one of the latest and greatest ways to create Vue 3 apps. And all I have is this custom button. And I have this components folder that has the button, and it's in this kebab case, and have this app.vue, which just shows the button. And by the way, at any time, feel free to pause this video or look at the description below, because I have timestamps where you can jump around to different places in the video to get what you need. If you just want to jump into slots, go ahead and jump into that. And I have also another app right here, and this is using Code Sandbox. It's the latest and greatest version of React, using React hooks and functional components. And I'll show you a little bit of how this works. And you can see from this, I just have a button here. It's returning this kind of JSX button. And inside my app right here, I'm just calling this button. So it's pretty simple. So I'll go ahead and start with looking at Vue, and then we'll go ahead and compare it to React. So I think the first thing we kind of want to look at when we look at this is, I think the first thing, anytime you create these primitives, and this is what I would consider like a primitive. So we're kind of wrapping functionality around a button so we can, make it a super button rather than just our plain HTML element button, is that we want to add in some ways to make changes to it. So in Vue and in React, there's something called props, and props are ways you can pass data from your parent component to a child component. The first way you do that is using this prop syntax in Vue. One thing to keep in mind, that props both in React and Vue are one way. So in other words, once the prop receives it in the child component, you can't change it and update it, because then it would mess things up and you get a big error in Vue and React. So you can't mutate your props. There is ways in both these frameworks and libraries to change that if you really wanted to. There's something called vModel in the Vue side, but we're not going to look at that today. We're going to assume this is like a vanilla Vue app, and we're going to try to do things the right way. The first thing you want to do is, if we look at this, we have custom button in React, we have custom button here, but once if we wanted to change this text, let's see kind of the one way of doing it. So the first way is you would use props, and props are just attributes you add inside the button right here inside this component. So I can create something called, button-text. So I'm going to do my Vue text, my Vue button. Pretty simple. And now for this to actually get on this button, we need to go into this custom button here, declare it as a prop. So to do that, you would do here, you do props. And there's two ways of doing props. We can use it, inside Vue, we can list it as an array. We can list it as an object. I'm going to list it as an object. And it was called, if we look back in here, we called it button text. I did it in kebab casing here, but you can actually write it both ways. So I'm gonna write it button text here, and this is kind of confusing. This is the way I usually like it in Vue. Whenever you're dealing with JavaScript, I write it in the camel casing. That's where you have a lowercase for the first word, and the second word is uppercase. And then I use kebab casing, which has that dash in the middle whenever I'm putting it inside HTML. Rather than in React, where usually you use camel casing everywhere. So I'll put button text here, and now I can put what type it is. I can just say it's type string. And instead of having this custom button here, I can just put double squirrely brackets instead of single curly brackets that you would have in the React side. And I can just put in button text. So if I did this right, it should show up. Cool, so now it says my Vue button. Now you can do something very similar in the React side. So if I wanted inside my app here, I could just pass in, I know, button text, and you can do it a couple different ways. I don't know, we could do like this, my React button. I'll save it, and now inside my button side here, all I have is this custom button here, but I can delete this custom button, squirrely brackets, curly brackets, or squirrely like I like to call them, and we can do props.button text. If we save it, cool, it shows up my React button. So we know things are working correctly. Now, obviously this is not I figure like this is an okay way of doing it, but what typically happens is that you want to be able to directly add props in a little bit quicker. And if you have lots of different ones, you're gonna have to declare them in every single one of these, and it can be a little bit of a pain. So there's a way of getting around this in both Vue and React. So typically, instead of doing button dash text right here, instead of doing this button text here, what I can do is I'll just put this my Vue button, well, not in quotes, but I'll put in my Vue button right here. And I want it to, auto magically work. And if you look at it, it says my Vue button, but if I change this my Vue button, I know 1, 2, 3, save it, refresh, it's just empty. So it definitely didn't work. So to get this in between the opening and closing brackets of the Vue of the component to work, this is where slots come in. So instead of putting button text here and passing this as a prop, so I'm gonna delete this button text out, and I'll delete this out too, we can do something called slots. So you just put slot and put slot here, and then it passes in the value. So look right here, my Vue button 1, 2, 3, so already updated. So now I have the button text in there, as you would expect. Now on the React side, you could do something similar. So instead of passing this in as a prop through button text right here, we can just same thing. We can do my React button 1, 2, 3. Once again, it doesn't do anything here, but inside our button component, instead of doing props.button text, we could do props.children. Cool, and it works. My React button 1, 2, 3. And if you wanted to, you can destructure it right here and just put in, and then you can just have children right here, and it works the same way. So here's my React button 1, 2, 3. So that's two different ways of doing it. Kind of similar in that respect as well. Now there's one thing you can do is there's name slots. So let's say we wanted to, so here's the button, my button Vue 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. But we wanted to have like something above and below it. So I could do something like this. In Vue, I would have slot, just like I had before. I'm just gonna copy and paste this a couple of times. And then I put something called name in here. And this is the name slot. So I can name this top and name this bottom. And then I can basically assign values to top and bottom. So right now, go back here. You see just my Vue button 1, 2, 3. But if I wanted to assign values to those two, I can do a couple of things here. Now, anything inside the opening and closing brackets in our parent component will go in the default slot. That's one that doesn't have any names. But if I wanted to put stuff into it where it does have names, I have to use this template syntax. And this changed a little bit between different versions of Vue, but this is typically the way you do it now. And then I do vslot, and I put a colon and then the name. So I'll put this as top. And then I can put something in here like this is on the top. And just to make sure that this works right, I'm gonna create a div. I'm gonna paste this in here. And so if you look at it, cool, it says this is on top. So now I have like placed text exactly where I want it to place it. And I can do the same thing with the bottom. Change this. This is actually supposed to be template here. Template. There we go. I have a typo. Here we go. And then we put it on this template. And then this will be vslot:top. Cool, that's working. And then at the bottom, we do another template and we close it. Let's see here, /template. And then this time we do vslot:bottom. And we'll put a div here, and this is on the bottom. Cool, so now we have the text on the top. This is on the top, this is on the bottom. So now we've placed text on the top and bottom using this template syntax. Now all we had to do is we did slot name equals top, slot name equals bottom. Now on the React side, you can do something similar. Oops, let's go back to app.js, and I'll show you something with the wrapper in a moment. But inside our button here, we have children, but we could have different children for top and bottom. So we can do children here. We can have children top. We can have children bottom. And we can even put like children default. And obviously this is not going to work right until we fix it. And then inside our app file here, inside the opening and closing brackets, we just like pass in an object. And this object will have a top, and we can put in a div here. This is the top, and a closing div. Cool. And then we'll have a bottom here. We'll have a default, and put a div React button. And then we'll have a bottom, which would be, by the way, I need commas here because this is an object. And we'll put div, this is the bottom. And we'll close it. And if we did that right, cool. So now we've done similar things using children, but it's a little bit different syntax. Instead of using templates, you kind of have to create an object that you send in that's then destructured on the other side. Cool, so now we have bottom, top, and button, top, bottom, and this default slot. But what happens if we wanted to we can actually do default values as well if we wanted to. So in here, let's say I didn't include my view button. Like I said, we'll go back over here. My view button 1, 2, 3. And I deleted this out. And now if you look here and I save it, now it's just missing. So you can do default values a couple different ways. But I can actually, in between the opening and closing brackets, the slot, I can put a default value. So I can say view button. Now if we do that, now view button's here, so now I have a default value. And you can do the same thing. Anything between the opening and closing brackets of the slot becomes the default value. And you can probably do something the same here. You could check to see if children.top, like children.default. You could do a ternary operator here. If this is there, then send in the children.default. Otherwise, put in I don't know, React R button. So now if you go back up here to this app.js, if you didn't include the default in here, now it says R button. So you can see that's one way of doing default values inside here. One difference between Vue and React is that Vue, you can have an inheritance for props too, so you don't necessarily always have to declare them. So you don't always have to declare props. So one thing you can do also is, let's say you don't have, in the React world, you don't necessarily have any, if you don't need to like name children, you can do something like this. So if I go back to app.js and I delete this top and bottom, and I save it, and I go back here to my button, and I'll delete these because they don't exist. And if I wanted to just include anything, and I wanted not have to use props.children everywhere and declare props and put exactly where they want, a really common way I've seen is you have your props right here, and you just spread the props on the top of the component, and then anything you pass down will be just sent over. So in this case, if I put button here and I put the name of the button, hello world, it automatically adds it to the top of the button here, which is really cool. So this is what typically I've seen a lot of different apps. People don't necessarily take each individual item out of the props, especially if you're using like this primitive pattern that we have here. A lot of times all the people do is just they spread the props on the button itself, and then you don't have to worry about that. So you can kind of do something similar in Vue too. So I'm going to delete these slots so we don't all get confused, but we'll look at slots again in a moment. Well, let's leave just the default slot for now. So we'll make sure you have the default slot, and then inside the app view, and we'll look back at our app here. So we have nothing. And we'll just delete these templates, and we'll have default view button. We'll save it. Cool, it says default view button. But what happens if we want to like change the color of this button here? So one thing we can do is, even though you have to declare certain props, if you don't declare the props inside Vue, so inside this button and declare it here, props will just be added to the topmost. It'll basically be inherited to the topmost element in your component, in the child component. So I could just pass in here, my app, I can pass in class and pass in text for XL. So I'm using Tailwind CSS, so this is a class that's already in there. And it went ahead and just made it a lot bigger. So if I do, I don't know, SM for small, you can see here it turned it very small. So, and if you look at the console, which I don't know if you could see very well, but it actually just added it onto that component itself, which is really cool. So I don't have to necessarily go into this button, declare everything I'm passing in, all these classes inside the button, because it'll just automatically add it into the topmost element. But you can change that behavior too if you wanted. Let's say you did have a div here, a div, just wrapping it. Or inside Vue 3, you can actually have multiple root elements. And you didn't want, and let's say instead of doing text small, I don't know, we do text blue, let's do yellow, I don't know, 600. If I do it, you can see it never changed here, because the problem being is that it always adds it to the top element, which is that empty div tag. So it added to the empty div tag. But what we can do inside Vue is we use something called inheritAttrs. We do inheritAttrs, and then we put this to false, and then we can bind it directly on here. So we do vbind, and this is where it gets a little crazy. This is a Vueism. You do attrs, $attrs, and what that does is now it binds it to wherever I do that $attrs. So now it bound it to here, and it doesn't necessarily bind it to the top level. And you just got to remember this key here, inheritAttrs, to do that. While on the React side, it's a little bit different. Once you do this spread operator with the props, anything you pass down will be added in there. So if you wanted to add in like another class, you could just pass in the class in here. Class, I don't know, let's say I had a class yellow. I think I do have a class yellow. So yeah, the text turned yellow here because I have a class I made before I started this video called yellow that just makes the text yellow. So now I can do that and it overwrites what's in there. So now that you maybe understand a little bit about slots, let's talk a little bit more about props for a moment. So we saw we can have a default slot here, and we saw we can use this bind attrs and inheritAttr in $attrs. But one thing I've definitely seen from some of my React friends is the idea of sending information as a prop versus emitting information out. So let's say in this button here, I wanted to pass in something. So obviously we have this button, and we want it to do something when you press the button. And there's this idea in both Vue and React that you kind of pass in values, you pass data down, but there's this actions or methods back up. The idea is that you don't want to put a bunch of logic in your child components, especially if they're primitives and they're supposed to be like dumb components. You want to put a lot of that logic, at least the business type logic, one level up, and then make it so when the button presses that it presses the button higher up in the hierarchy. In other words, I'll show you. So instead of having this button here, I can make a function, and I'll call it onClick. And on the click, I'm just going to do alert says was clicked. And the way you can pass this down is a few ways. So in the React world, I think a lot of people do it like this. And you can do this same thing in the Vue world. So you can just do this colon here, which is the same thing as vbind. So you can do colon, and you can do onClick or whatever you want to call it, and you pass in the name of the method. So in this case, I'm passing in this onClick method. And then inside here in this the button, it would, since we're going to go ahead and delete this div right here to make it back the way it was, declare it as a prop. And we called it, once again, it's called onClick. onClick. And from here, we can put in what type it is, and we can type, it's a type function. And then this onClick, we'll assign it to this button right here. So when you go click, it does the onClick. So let's see if that worked. So if I did it right, if I click it, cool, it says was clicked here. This little alert window opens up. Cool. So you're kind of passing the function down, and we can even be more fancy and add a method here. But really, this is one way to do it, but I kind of prefer this other way, and that's using the events syntax in Vue. So you can pass text, you can pass events down as props, but what the thing that changes is you put add right here and onClick, and you pass in whatever the name of it is, onClick. And then inside the button itself, instead of, it's no longer a prop, it's actually, you can do emits here. I guess you can do emits, which is the kind of the Vue 3 way of declaring that you have events. And then inside here, inside this, doing this onClick here, you do $emit, and then you put it the name of what you're emitting. So in this case, onClick. Oops, I actually need single quotes here. And if I do that correctly, it should work the same way. Yeah, was clicked. So we know that's still working. And so you just do this $emit, and the way I think of it is it fires and forgets. Like, you can't return values from your emit. So that's one thing that's confusing, is if you pass in as props, you can actually pass in the whole function down, and then it can return values. But when you use this event syntax, you're emitting values back, and you're just firing it off, and you're forgetting it. And you may be thinking, well, why would you ever do this? I think in the Vue world, it just really separates the parent logic and component from the child component and logic, because it says, you know, you're not supposed to like pass your functions down from your parent component to the child component, because you can because that just kind of mixes your business logic together. In this case, you're just saying, hey, let me emit something to the parent component. So in the React world, that's not really the case. You never emit things back. The typical way you would do it is you would have this button here. You would, let's say here, just look on this one right here. If you wanted to add a click handler into the child component, you do onClick, and then you would have this curly bracket, and then you can do, I don't know, we can do the same thing with an arrow function and do alert test. And if we did that right, when you click it, it says test. So it's still working the same way. And if you wanted to, you can move this logic up from the child component to the parent component. And since we know that we're spreading the props operator, should work the same way. It does. If you do test 1, 2, 3, test 1, 2, 3. So it's still working the same way. It's just a different kind of pattern. We're always passing this downward. We could also refactor this into its own component. So like function my component, or onClick comp function, and then it could do basically the same thing, and alert my func, and then instead of passing it in like this alert right here, we can just like call this method onClick f like this, and it would do the same thing, my func. So that's just a little bit a different way to do it in the React side of things. Now, the last thing I want to show you guys is about scope slots, and maybe compare that to how React does something similar. So remember how I showed you how you could do slots, and you can have data in there? So you can actually push data back from your child component back to your parent component using scope slot. And this gets a little confusing, so if it does, feel free to pause this and rewatch it a few times. But let's say I have this default. Let's say I created another slot here, and let's keep the default slot to keep it simple. And I want to pass something back in. So I don't know. I can even do a data object here or methods. Let's do let's pretend it's data. And in this data object, I'm going to return something called I guess this is a button, so it's not as pertinent, but I kind of like this idea of having how many times it was clicked. So let's do clicked and put 0 here. And so in here, we're going to have the default for this button show for the name of the button. So view button, and then put in double curly brackets clicked. And every time it gets clicked, I'm going to set, instead of emitting a data here, I'm going to create a new thing called methods. And this methods is going to have on click handler, and it's just going to take this clicked here, and I'm going to increment it. And so it should, every time I click, if I put in this on click, it should increment. So let's see if it works right. Let me take this on click here out. And I don't think I love this yellow text, so I'm just going to delete that out too. Okay, it says default view button, and we want to say if you don't have any buttons, it should default to the text. View button 0, cool. And if you click on it, it's incrementing. But now if we want to have the slot data, let's say we want to change the name of the button, but we still want that click count somewhere. So default button. If I change it, you see I lost that click, but I want to show how many clicks it is. And so I need to somehow grab this click data and push it back up to the parent component. So it's available. So the cool thing about this is all you do is in this slot right here, you can put something called this colon here, and then put in anything you want to call it. Let's call it clicked, and then you pass in clicked. And then it's now accessible by the parent component. And the way it works is like this. So just like we did before with the template, so I can add a template here. I'll close the template. And now I have access to vSlot. And if I don't have any colon after the vSlot, it's the default slot. And now I can grab stuff from the child component. And we know we have something called clicked. And I'm going to destructure it. It comes as an object. And now I can do this. Default button. And then I can conclude this clicked here. Now if I save that, now I have clicked, and I click it, and it increments as it's supposed to. So I have been able to grab the data out of this clicked, out using the scope slot. So I'm grabbing it from the child component and passing it back to the parent component so it can use it inside this template right here, which is could be a little confusing at first, but it's pretty powerful way of doing things. In the React side, you can do something similar. So I think the button example isn't the greatest, but let's if we do this wrapper here. I created this wrapper that all it does is it creates this use effect. It has an array of data, and as soon as it loads, it sets this data. And then I did this thing here where it returns this data.map. It maps through the data, and then it takes the children, which is right here, and it adds in the value from it. So this is kind of, you may want to consider like a data provider pattern. And now I can access it in the parent component. So to access that in the parent component, I'm going to copy and paste this from the other screen. But essentially, I can add something like this. So this wrapper, which I'm going to have to import in, it's going to import in wrapper from wrapper. Oops, there it is. So now I've kind of used this provider pattern, which is grabbing data from the child component, from this wrapper, and it's providing it back up to the parent component. And all I'm doing is I'm doing wrapper here in between the closing and opening and closing brackets, the component. I'm pulling out D, and then I'm just using showing the div here, and it's grabbing all the numbers out. So I think this is sort of similar to using the scope slots, because we're passing data from our child component back to the parent component and doing it that way. You can do the same thing here in the Vue side by just creating a template that doesn't do anything other than return values that you can then grab from the parent component. One thing to keep in mind, I'll show you real quickly. So yeah, if you click, I'm gonna create a new file here called, we'll call it the wrapper.vue. And I'm gonna use a quick trick here. That was a extension that I have that will create stuff for me. And then inside here, I don't know, I could, and by the way, I've been using kind of the Vue 2 syntax. I'm not going to use the Vue 3 syntax just not to confuse people, but you can do the same thing with the Vue 3 with a setup function. But I'm going to do a data object here, and it's going to return something called data, and that's going to have 15, 22, 52, 25, something else in there. And I can expose that back up to the parent component. So this doesn't really need to do much other than have a, we'll add a div in here. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. So we'll have a slot, and this slot will, I'll close it here. The slot will have will pass in the data object. So that's all this has, is just this one slot that passes in this data object, and it has this wrapper div around it. So I guess just to be consistent, we can delete the wrapper div. So now we can import the wrapper back into here. So I'm going to import the wrapper from components, the wrapper.vue. There it is. And now I can use the wrapper. And it doesn't show anything. If I look back here, I don't see anything. But I could now, since I'm exposing some stuff, I have a template here. And I remember vslot, it's the default slot, and it was called, I called it data. So in the top app here, I can grab the data out. I'm going to destructure it here, data. And now it's an array of data, so I can use a v4, which is kind of like using the map inside React. I can put d in data, and I'm going to add an index too. Key, I think I should have done that on the React side, but I didn't, but that's fine. And I'm just going to have a d here. So if I did that right, it should show up. Cool, so here they are. Just to make it so they're on separate lines, I'll wrap it in a div. And I'll refresh. Oh, you know what? Because of the way I'm doing my flex box here, down here, let's see here, wrapper, display, flex. We can do flex direction column. I'm going to create a separate, inside this wrapper here, I'm going to create a div here. I'm going to move this. I'm going to move this up. And then I'll put, there we go. So now we have it right there. Let's change this flex. Let's do this. Let's do flex direction column. Cool. So now we have 15 and 5. So it's definitely working correctly as we expected, which is awesome. And now we have this kind of wrapper here, similar to the way we had it inside React. Okay. All right. Just one last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up is that this syntax, there's another way to do this in Vue 3. Instead of kind of exposing data using scope slots in Vue, you could refactor this and take this data or whatever calculation you're doing from this wrapper and put it into its own composable in Vue, and then have that be available for the parent component to use, and you can share it between multiple components. So you don't necessarily have to kind of use this provider pattern that you have in Vue. So I hope you guys learned something. I went through it pretty quickly, but I appreciate it. If you guys like this video, make sure you click that like button and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And let me know what I should do for my next video in the comments below. Thanks.